So again, welcome to Tools for Managing Stress and Reducing Burnout. As mentioned, my name is Jennifer, and throughout today's webinar, again, if you have any questions or curiosities, please feel free to share them with us as we go. And what we're going to do, I'd like to start us off with a quote, actually. And so this is a quote that I recently came across that I thought just applied to what's, everything that's going on in the world. There's a lot happening in the world, and it's extra important that we take care of ourselves these days so that we can continue to take care of our communities. And this is a quote that I came across that I thought highlighted that really well, where although the world is full of suffering, it is also full of overcoming it. This is from Helen Keller. So just a nice one to start us off for today. And in today's session, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a lot about mindfulness, and I'll provide us with a definition of mindfulness in a moment, because I'm sure it's a word that we've all heard before. But what exactly is it, and how exactly is it helpful? So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about how mindfulness is a tool that can support our well-being when we consistently practice it. We're going to talk about how and why these tools help, and we're going to go over the physiology of how and why these tools help, so we can have that intellectual understanding of it, and we'll also have more of an embodied understanding of it as well after today's session. And we're going to go over 3 practical exercises for daily well-being, because it's one thing to kind of know these things. And I'm really going to emphasize the importance of practicing these tools to support our well-being. And hopefully the tools that I share today will feel accessible to you on a daily basis. So rather than thinking of it as like another thing to add to our to-do lists, we'll talk about ways of really integrating these practices into our daily lives, so it feels like it's enhancing our life versus just another thing to do. So the definition of mindfulness that I like to use is that mindfulness is our ability to intentionally pay attention to one thing for an extended period of time without judgment. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means. And even within today's webinar, I encourage you to think of mindfulness as, even during this webinar, we're all going to get distracted. And our mind takes us to thinking about what we have to do later and the embarrassing thing that we said yesterday. And then at some point, you bring your attention back to the sound of my voice, or to looking at your computer screen, and coming back to kind of noticing what's going on right now in the present. So I invite you to kind of think of that as fundamentally mindfulness in action, where even during this webinar, you have opportunities to notice your mind wanders, we get distracted, and then we're going to come back to noticing the sound of my voice, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go. So why are these mindfulness tools that we've all been hearing about for many years really helpful? So one way of understanding well-being and stress is with this idea of a window of tolerance. And this is a term that was coined by Dr. Dan Siegel and Dr. Pat Ogden in the 90s. And they both do a lot of work around the biology of human connection. So this idea of a window of tolerance is a term that's gaining a lot of popularity these days. So if some of this information is new for you, or if some of this is information that you're revisiting, I encourage you to know that, the more we revisit this information or learn more about it as we go, the more it can support us as we support ourselves and continue supporting our communities. So just like anything in life, the more we practice something, the easier it can become. So including having a better understanding of our physiology and our stress response, the more we practice that understanding, the easier it can become over time to recognize our stress response and take care of ourselves and meet ourselves where we're at. So we'll go more into that now. So this idea of a window of tolerance suggests that we all have a window of tolerance. We all have a certain capacity where we're able to stay feeling curious, we're able to stay feeling mindful, we're able to stay feeling capable of responding thoughtfully to whatever life is throwing our way. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we feel happy all the time, or we feel content, or we're satisfied. It means that whatever might be happening, we feel capable of responding thoughtfully to it, rather than having our stress responses or our reactivity or states of overwhelm take over. So within our window of tolerance, we can think of it like a container that grows and shrinks throughout our whole lives. So in this container, we can feel angry, we can feel frustrated, we can feel depressed, we can feel anxious, we can feel happy and joyful and excited. And if we get a sense like, yes, the situation might suck, it might be challenging, and I got this. I can figure out how I want to respond to the situation rather than just react to it. We could think of that as being in our window of tolerance. And I'm just going to open up the chat here so I can see what's going on at the same time. Hello, folks. Welcome. And so that container of our window of tolerance, as I mentioned, grows and shrinks throughout our whole lives. So when there's a lot of ongoing stress in our lives and not enough support to keep up with the level of stress, and support is things like community care, healthcare, education, getting our basic needs met, empathy, support, etc., etc. If the level of stress outweighs our level of support in our lives, our window of tolerance is going to shrink over time, thus causing us to go into states of distress or higher levels of stress or states of hyper and hypoarousal, which I'll talk more about in a few moments, a little bit more easily than we may have in the past. And a common experience for folks these days is that a lot of people are feeling like they're a lot less capable of handling what life is throwing their way with all of the stressors that have been happening in our personal lives, in the global world, everywhere pretty much. There's been high levels of stress happening. So if you're noticing that your own capacity to handle what life is throwing your way is different or less than it was 5 years ago, I encourage you to know that even though that's highly unpleasant to experience, it's a normal biological response with all that's been going on. And just like our window of tolerance can shrink, our window of tolerance can also grow. So we've kind of started talking about ways of growing our window of tolerance by bringing mindfulness into our attention a little bit more. So these things that we like to do to take care of ourselves, whether it's a mindfulness practice or taking a walk with our pets, or staying hydrated, or connecting with our loved ones, or taking time to rest, whatever that looks like for each and every one of you, know that even though we sometimes minimize the importance of it, it actually has profound impacts on our physiology, and it supports us in growing our window of tolerance. If we use this as a way of understanding stress and well-being. So it's also perfectly normal for us to go in and out of our window of tolerance pretty much each and every day. So the goal with this is not to always be in our window of tolerance. That's just not possible as people. Ideally, what we can develop is our capacity to recognize what state our stress response might be in, or our physiology might be in, so that we can meet ourselves from that place. So we can start to recognize, okay, my stress levels are high. What do I need to do to take care of myself so that I don't eventually burn myself out? Because one of the reasons we experience burnout is because we think we have unlimited amounts of energy as people, but the reality is that we don't. Our biology only has a certain amount of energy to use. So the more we can kind of keep track of what's going on in our internal states and meet ourselves where we're at, this can support us in preventing burnout. So some of these states are when we get taken out of our window of tolerance, and we go into that reactive or that stress response or that state of overwhelm. We could think of it as being in a state of hyper or hypoarousal, or a little bit of both. It's not necessarily one or the other. I've laid it out as 3 different sections here, just for the sake of talking about it. And one way of thinking about these 3 pieces of hyperarousal, window of tolerance, and hypoarousal is we can kind of think of them as volume knobs on a stereo. So I don't know when the last time many of us touched a stereo was, but if you think of it like, you know, when one of the volume knobs is on high, it's not that the other ones are off. It's that they're all always on some level. And whichever one is the loudest is the one that's running the show, so to speak. So when we get taken out of our window of tolerance and we go into a state of hyperarousal, this is when our defenses of flight, fight, and freeze are running the show. And my assumption is that most folks are pretty familiar with those terms of flight, fight, and freeze. And if you are, that's great. And if you aren't, I'll talk more about them as we go. We might notice we have higher levels of fear or terror or rage or hypervigilance happening when we're in this state. We might be more impulsive in negative ways. We might have more intrusive thoughts happening. And one way to learn to recognize our internal state is to learn to recognize what types of thoughts we're having or what types of thinking patterns we have, which I'll talk more about in a moment. And it takes practice. And even though it can be highly unpleasant to experience these states of flight, fight, or freeze, it fundamentally serves the biological purpose of supporting our survival. So there's nothing wrong with us for going into those states. It fundamentally means that we're human. So on that note, I'm just going to check in with the Q&A here. So one question coming up is, can window of tolerance shrink and expand at the same time for different emotions in people? So with being human, there's rarely ever one answer to any of this. It's such a nuanced experience. So my short answer would be yes, probably, is that in some areas of our lives, it can feel like our window of tolerance is growing and we have so much capacity to handle what's going on in our homes, let's say. And then at work, it can feel like we have a lot less capacity, or vice versa. So I'd say that yes, probably at the same time, for different types of experiences and different types of feelings, we can get curious about how our window of tolerance is showing up in our lives. Yeah, great question. Thanks for asking. I'm going to tune into the chat. Same question. Perfect. Great. And so I'll start talking about that state of hypoarousal. And so this is when our defenses of shutting down and submitting to what's going on around us is running the show. And people who experience the state of hypoarousal, which it's incredibly common. I myself tend to be somebody who's more on that hypoaroused state when I'm stressed out versus that hyperaroused. So it's something that I've learned to recognize in myself. So now I know how to kind of meet myself where I'm at and be like, okay, I'm noticing I'm a bit more shut down. I don't have a lot of energy left to give. And instead of trying to push through it, like, what do I need to do to support myself in that? So we'll talk more about that as we go. So in this state of hypoarousal, people might have more of a flat affect, meaning less of a range of an emotional tone. They might feel more numb or not really there. We kind of get a sense like somebody's physically in the room with us, but it feels like they're a million miles away. I'm sure we've all had that experience, whether it's with ourselves or with others. Like, it's incredibly common, and it's very human for us to experience these things. Our biology is quite brilliant when it comes to supporting our survival. People in this state often experience, high levels of shame or despair or depression. Our cognitive functioning can be slower than we would like it to be or than it usually is. And I put the word lazy here in quotes because I think another opportunity to bring more curiosity to our lives is when we start using this kind of language of like lazy or unmotivated or, what's wrong with me? Why can't I get off the couch today? Or what's wrong with this person? Why can't they get anything done? When we start using this kind of language with ourselves or with others, I invite you to get some curiosity back to the situation and wonder, I wonder what state somebody's physiology might be in. Because if we have a better understanding of what state our own or other people's physiology might be in, their behavior might make a lot more sense. And I do want to say that just because we can understand why somebody's behaving a certain way, it doesn't mean that we have to tolerate those behaviors. So if we could do an entire webinar on boundaries, that would be a really good opportunity to talk more about boundaries, which I'll save for another day. And so in this state of hypoarousal, some types of thoughts that we can learn to recognize could be thoughts of like feeling worthless, feeling helpless, feeling hopeless. And again, even though it can be highly unpleasant to experience, it fundamentally serves the biological purpose of supporting our survival. And something that I also want to highlight, because it's a pretty cool thing, is that our window of tolerance, with enough practice and taking care of ourselves and learning to recognize our internal states, with enough practice, our window of tolerance can actually grow to include all of the information that's listed on this slide. So when those states of hyper and hypoarousal do start taking over or running the show, so to speak, instead of it feeling so overwhelming or we become so reactive or feel powerless to it, we can start saying things to ourselves like, I'm noticing that I'm going into a bit of a fight response. Maybe let me take a couple of breaths or some space to myself so I don't behave in ways that aren't so optimal for myself or for other people. Or we can start to say things to ourselves, like, I'm noticing I am starting to shut down. I'm starting to lose patience, lose tolerance for being able to respond thoughtfully to what's happening around me. What do I need to do to support myself? So we can learn to recognize all of these states. So I'll talk more about that as we go. And move ahead here. So we've already started talking about some ways of learning to recognize these internal states by noticing what types of thoughts we're having. So I think a really common experience, if we start thinking about thoughts, is, how many of you have ever experienced ruminating thoughts or racing thoughts, where you're fixated on this one stressor and you have trouble thinking about anything else and you feel like you're being consumed by it? So I'm assuming we've all had that kind of experience before, right? Even maybe this morning you've had that kind of experience. It's incredibly common. It's incredibly normal. It's part of being human. And the more that we can learn to recognize it, the more we can say to ourselves, oof, I'm noticing I'm having a lot of racing thoughts. Or I'm noticing I'm having a lot of, I'm thinking and thinking, and it's so sticky, the stressor. What can I do to kind of support myself, knowing that that's what's going on internally? So some other ways that stress might show up are things like, muscle aches, or not feeling like we can get enough breath, or a lot of fatigue, or muddled thinking, or impaired judgment, or a lot of negativity, or nightmares, low libido, changes in our menstrual cycles. We become more fussy. We don't feel as confident as we might normally feel. So the thing with all of these is that, yes, they could also be caused from other things as well. So the important part here is to really get curious about what's going on in our internal state so that we can really kind of have a better understanding of what's going on for us. So for example, headaches can also be from dehydration, right? So in this time where I am, it's been quite hot this week. So being mindful to stay hydrated is a really important piece so that headaches don't come. So while, yes, stress can cause these things, other things can as well. So the important part is getting curious and kind of listening to the cues that our biology is giving us to let us know that something is going on, and it's important to listen to it. And then we can decide how we want to respond to it rather than just react to it or have our stress responses take over. And if you feel like it, if there's anything that you've noticed in yourself as to how stress shows up that isn't on this list, please feel free to type it into the chat as we go, because there's many other things that stress can show up as. And we can learn a lot from each other by sharing it. I notice with stress, sometimes I get a ringing in my ear. So I know when I have that ringing in my ear that I should do things to kind of support my well-being, because my biology is letting me know my stress response is kind of going on, taking over. So feel free to write in the chat if there's anything that you notice in yourself about stress showing up, or what that looks like for you if it's not already listed here. And if it is already listed here, feel free to also just share it in your own words. I'm just going to take a moment here to check in and see if there's anything else I want to highlight as to how stress can show up before I move ahead. Yeah, I think another thing I'd like to say too, with things like, depression or apathy or alienating ourselves or a loss of appetites or a loss of libido, a lot of people can be really hard on themselves when they have those experiences. And something that I've really appreciated over the years for myself and for my communities is when we can have that understanding of what state our physiologies might be in, that is kind of running the show and leading to these kinds of experiences such as depression or apathy or alienation. It can really help us realize that, oh, it's not that there's something wrong with me, it's that this is actually a normal biological response, even though it's highly unpleasant to experience. So I know for myself, when I hear that, it kind of takes the pressure off of me for thinking there's something wrong with me, or why am I not capable of doing what I was capable of doing last year? It's just there's so much going on in our lives, personally, globally. Even if it's on the other side of the planet, it has an impact on us. So I encourage you to be really compassionate with yourself and others that might be having these kinds of experiences, knowing that it's a normal biological response to stress, even though it can be highly unpleasant to experience. Kind of tuning into the chat a little bit, jaw clenching or teeth grinding. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. Noticing how many stress responses we're experiencing. Yeah, it can be highly unpleasant to experience it, and hopefully it feels empowering to kind of recognize it, because it also means that we're able to listen to our biologies a little bit more. So when we're able to recognize that it's happening, that awareness is kind of like a superpower. So we're able to say, you know what, I'm noticing I have one from each of these categories if we use the colors as categories, right? And so now we can say to ourselves, okay, maybe it is time that I go home and rest tonight. Maybe it is time that I hydrate, or that I eat a nourishing meal, or I connect with loved ones, or I seek out support, right? So we don't need to do this all on our own as well. So at the end of today's webinar, I'm also going to talk about other resources that we can reach out to for support, because while mindfulness is great as a tool to support us, it's also extremely important that we reach out to our communities for help as well. So I'll talk more about that as we go. My sister calls worrying, which is my middle name, borrowing trouble, which she often says to me, don't borrow trouble. Oh, that's pretty cute. Yeah, I enjoy that one too. Yeah, don't borrow trouble. Yeah. I also, what I'm appreciating about that is we can have a little bit of fun with this too, right? Can we learn to laugh at ourselves a little bit? Because as humans, we all have these stress responses. And sometimes, while yes, they're important to listen to, a little bit of, lightness can also help us ease some of that. And also being able to recognize them supports us in coming back to our window of tolerance and growing our window of tolerance so that we can choose how we want to respond. So I'm going to move ahead here for the sake of time, and please feel free to keep sharing ideas in the chat. It's pretty fun to read. So what I'll do next is I'll talk about 3 different parts of our biology that can support us in having a deeper understanding of how and why stress shows up. So the first part of our biology that I'll talk about is a part of our brain called our amygdala. And you've actually got 2 of them. And it has a variety of roles. And one of its roles is to help you kind of pay attention to what's going on around you. It helps you detect danger. So you could think of it as one of its roles is to be kind of like the smoke alarm of your brain. So similar to a smoke alarm, it'll constantly scan the environment, making sure that you're safe. And when it detects danger, it'll go off like a smoke alarm, and it'll become reactionary, defensive. Stress hormones get released that are fundamentally designed to keep us safe. We'll go into those states of flight, fight, freeze, or shutdown, or a little bit of all of them sometimes. And it's part of the brain that stores memories of events. So later on, I'll talk to you about something called the negativity bias, where along with our flight, fight, freeze, and shutdown response, we have something called the negativity bias that fundamentally supports our survival, even though it can be highly unpleasant to experience. So when this amygdala goes off like a smoke alarm, it'll send a signal to that flight, fight, freeze, and shutdown response. Again, stress hormones get released. We react rather than being able to respond thoughtfully. And again, highlighting the fact that it's a normal biological response, and we go into that survival state. So it's happened to the best of us. I'm sure we can all think of a moment, even maybe today or this week, where we're like, yeah, I totally went into that reactionary mode and I said something or I did something that I didn't really need to say or do in that moment. I'm just kind of, that scanning process is referring to as neuroception, right? Yeah, kind of all of these different types of like interoception is looking at our inner lives. Neuroception is kind of like scanning things that are happening. So again, kind of getting curious about what's going on, and that scanning process is part of neuroception. Absolutely. Yeah, great comments and questions. And then a part of our biology that I'll speak to is a part of our brain called our prefrontal cortex. And this is a part of our brain that actually finishes kind of developing in our mid-20s is the average. So if you've got kids or you work with little ones, we want to remind ourselves that the part of our brain that's capable of having like clear insights about ourselves, that helps us to regulate our internal states, that helps us to modify that fear response, or that helps us to think flexibly when problem solving rather than just going into those flight, fight, freeze, and shutdown responses, that helps us to see the bigger picture, or that helps us to think of future consequences to our behavior. This part of our brain actually finishes developing when we're older. So when we're asking our little ones to think of future consequences to hitting your brother, or see the bigger picture of this situation, we want to remind ourselves as adults that our little ones actually cannot comprehend those concepts yet on a developmental level. So we're kind of wasting our breath as adults, and we get really frustrated with our little ones when they don't understand our reasoning. When the reality is that developmentally, they're not cognitively capable of understanding that kind of reasoning yet. So one of the best things we can do when supporting our little ones is to regulate our own internal state. And this is also supportive for ourselves, because when we're able to regulate our internal state and stay responsive rather than reactive, this supports us in regulating our stress levels as well. So if we're constantly getting stressed out about people who aren't understanding our concepts, or we're having difficulty connecting with our little ones, being able to take a breath, or whatever it is that we do as parents or as people with little ones or people who support little ones, whatever we do to settle our own nervous systems or our own physiology, really supports us in being able to stay present and supports our stress levels along the way. And so before we try out a tool to sort of support ourselves in coming back to this prefrontal cortex, I'm going to use my hand to make a model of the brain, because I think that might be a great support to actually understand all of the information that I was sharing, which can sometimes feel like a lot. I'm just going to go back to the previous slide. And so my palm is going to represent that a part of our brain that does things that support our survival without us having to consciously think about doing them. So things like breathing, or digesting your food, or your heart beating, or whatever your liver is doing right now. Like, I have no idea what my liver is doing right now, but it's doing something to support my survival. And that flight, fight, freeze, and shutdown response, right? We don't consciously choose to go into those reactions. Our biology is doing it to support our survival. And then my thumb, folding over my palm, is going to represent that amygdala. So the amygdala is that part of our brain where one of its roles is to constantly scan the environment, making sure that we're safe. And when it detects danger, it'll go off like a smoke alarm, and it'll send a signal to the palm part of the brain. And it'll say, hey, right now I think we're in danger. So we've got to flight, fight, or freeze, or shut down in order to stay safe. And it all happens really, really quick. So again, I'm sure we can all relate to these processes taking over, and it happens really quickly. And then we say things to our partners or our families that we didn't necessarily need to say. And then that prefrontal cortex is represented by my fingers folding over my thumb. So when our whole brain is working optimally, and what I want to say about that is that that looks different for each and every one of us. There's no one perfect way the brain is supposed to function. You know, I hope that we all live in a world one day where we can all learn about our unique individual brains and what best supports us and works best for us. And, you know, hopefully we get there at some point. And when there is an optimal connection to this part of the brain, what's happening when this part goes off, when that smoke alarm goes off, is that instead of sending a signal to this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex can kick in and it'll say, like, yes, this situation sucks and we got this. We can figure out how we want to thoughtfully respond to the situation, rather than what we call flip our lids, lose connection to this part of the brain, and have our amygdalas take over. So part of the beauty of mindfulness, or our ability to intentionally pay attention to one thing for an extended period of time, is that that also helps strengthen the connections from this part of the brain to this part of the brain. And we're going to watch a video in a few moments about that. So I'll pause here for now just for the sake of time, and we'll get back to that in a few minutes. And so our first tool today to practice kind of how do we come back to our whole brain states? How do we settle some of that stress response? How do we come back to feeling more responsive rather than reactive? So our first tool is something called the STOP tool. And it's an acronym that stands for stop, take a breath, observe internally and externally without judgment. And doing ST and O allows us to proceed a little bit more thoughtfully. And then we can figure out, like, what matters most right now versus me going into that flight, fight, freeze, or shutdown response. So because we've been sitting for a little while, I'll invite you, if you feel like joining me in a practice. It's just going to take a couple of seconds. It's an opportunity to try out one of these tools. If you like it, that's great. If you don't like it, that's totally okay too. The beautiful thing about mindfulness is that we can also figure out what works well for us. It doesn't have to be the same thing that works for everybody else. So if you feel like getting a little stretch in from sitting or staring at your computer screen, I invite you to just find some gentle movement with whatever that looks like for you. Or you can stay exactly as you are. And whatever you're choosing to do, I invite you to take a moment to stop and Take a breath, knowing that there's no right or wrong way to do this. There's no perfect way to do this. It's an opportunity to slow down, even just for a moment, and observe internally and externally. Just maybe noticing your body sitting in the chair. If it's accessible to you, maybe look around the room a little bit and notice things just that are around you in your surroundings right now. Maybe you notice the sounds. And then in this moment for proceeding thoughtfully, I'll invite you to just take a moment to notice maybe what the quality of your attention is like after even just a short practice. Maybe it's something you appreciated, maybe it's something that didn't land well for you. Either way, it's just about noticing your experience in this and reminding ourselves that one of the words I'd like to highlight is that mindfulness really is a practice. So, similar to diet and exercise, the more we do something, the easier it can become. So we wouldn't expect somebody who's, never ran a marathon before to be able to run a marathon, right? If they've never ran before. We assume that they do something each and every day to practice, or whatever it is people do to practice a marathon. I don't actually know. I've never ran a marathon before, but people do something to practice to get up to that moment of challenge. So mindfulness is similar. When we can find ways of practicing it in our daily lives, or a little bit every so often, or whatever it might be, when we get to those challenging moments in life, when we start to feel a bit more reactive, we have that muscle built up a little bit. We have more capacity to slow down and notice what matters most right now. How can I respond thoughtfully to this situation? And again, it takes practice. So a handy little saying that I learned from Dr. Dan Siegel, who kind of gave us that idea of a window of tolerance as well, is that neurons that fire together wire together. So neurons are kind of like messengers in our brain that are basically saying, let's do this. And the more we do something, the stronger those neurons get. So again, mindfulness is really about paying attention and staying open and curious to what's going on right now. It's about staying compassionate with ourselves and others, which takes practice. Mindfulness is not a silver bullet for solving our problems. It can support our relationship to our problems, but it doesn't necessarily take problems away. It's not about being calm all the time or feeling fine all the time. It's about staying responsive. So if staying responsive is, if we're able to get angry and stay responsive to it, if we're able to be frustrated and stay responsive to it, rather than just having the anger or frustration take over, that's a great use of that kind of energy, right? Because sometimes we need to get angry. We need to be frustrated. Mindfulness is not about spacing out or escaping our experiences. And it's not the absence of thoughts or emotions. It's really about being able to just kind of recognize what's there and being able to respond more thoughtfully to it. So sometimes people think of, if they have a lot of thoughts, they're kind of not able to practice this or not able to find stillness, which is the case for many, many people. Right? And the idea is that it's not about having no thoughts. It's maybe about developing a bit more awareness of what it is that we're thinking about. Where do our thoughts go? So just kind of really staying curious about our experiences moment to moment is something I also kind of really appreciate from learning about mindfulness many years ago. So what we'll do next is we're going to watch a short video that talks a little bit more about this process of strengthening the connections from this part of our brain to this part of our brain. So as you watch the video, see if there's anything that stands out to you, and then feel free to type in any comments in the chat as we go.
The human brain is a profoundly complex organ. 90% of its activity occurs beneath conscious awareness, which means that even though we assume that we have some control of how we think, feel and behave, modern science suggests it's not so simple. The concept of neuroplasticity is a new and exciting area of science. It highlights that our brain is constantly being reshaped throughout our lives by both our experiences and our thoughts. We now know that it is the focus of our awareness that determines which brain networks are strengthened and which are weakened or lost. That means that when we get caught up in cycles of worry or irritability, these are the networks within the brain that become stronger. So the more we worry, the better we become at worrying. However, on the other side of this, if we practice being calm, clear and focused, we can strengthen these networks too. As humans, our brain differs from other animals. This is mostly due to the front areas of the brain called the frontal lobes, often called the new brain, as it was the last to develop in our evolution. When well developed, this part of our brain helps us to manage our strong emotions and respond with flexibility, even when we feel overwhelmed. It also helps us to tune into the feelings of others with empathy and insight. When we feel worried, distracted, or stuck on achieving goals, our brain function is more strongly dominated by our old brain, which has a part called the amygdala. The amygdala manages the powerful fight and flight response, which switches on when we feel stressed or anxious and releases hormones and chemicals such as cortisol and adrenaline. That is why stress has such a big impact on us. Mindfulness is a technique that can help us to manage this process more effectively by building our skills of attention, concentration, and a capacity to direct our awareness in a certain way. This all means that we're less likely to be swept up by a strong emotion and the power of the amygdala. It also means we can bring choice to our emotions and our thoughts. In doing so, we're playing an active role in changing the way the structure of our brain develops, in much the same way we can change the shape of our body by doing certain exercises at the gym. When we practice meditation regularly, we build a capacity to become aware of thinking and emotion. As our mind becomes more settled, our nervous system is able to take in more accurate information, and we can access capacities for creativity, flexibility, and lateral thinking, which enable us to manage challenging situations more skillfully. When we build skills of mindfulness, we still experience negative feelings like frustration, disappointment, fear, or irritability. But the research shows that we recover much more quickly. We now know from research into brain development that regular meditation and mindfulness practice reduces the size of the amygdala, reduces levels of stress hormones, and strengthens connections to the frontal lobes. This all means that we're more likely to live with less stress and more happiness.
So as we move ahead, for the sake of time, feel free to share any comments or curiosities or things that stood out to you in the video in the chat, if there's anything that you would like to share. And what we'll do next is we'll talk about another tool that can support us in managing our stress response. So at the beginning, I was talking about something called the negativity bias, where along with our fight, freeze, and shutdown response, we have something called the negativity bias that supports our survival. And the negativity bias is the phenomenon of giving more psychological weight to bad experiences than to good ones. So if we think of it like a scale, a bad experience, bad and good here don't necessarily mean like bad or good, so to speak. It's more like bad are things that get interpreted as a threat to our survival, and good are those experiences in life that aren't interpreted as a threat to our survival. So experiences that are interpreted as a threat to our survival, whether they're actually a threat to our survival or not, is a different question. But things that are experienced as bad or hard or challenging can often outweigh those good experiences. So if we think of it like a scale, it can take 3 positive experiences to outweigh 1 negative experience. So that's how heavy the negativity bias can be. So ideally, we keep that scale balanced. And balancing out the scale is not about ignoring the negative or sweeping the negative under the rug. It's about being able to say, like, yes, there's a lot going on in the world right now that causes my own physiology to kind of go all over the place all the time, and it increases my stress levels. And there's also things like I really appreciate the work that I get to do in my communities, and I really enjoy the simple cup of coffee I got to enjoy today. So it's not about taking one or the other or adding more weight to an experience versus the other. It's about keeping things balanced. Because when things get out of balance, we know that can be a little bit tricky for people. Right? So I'm sure we've all experienced those times in life when it feels like the negative side of that scale is outweighing the positive side of that scale. And so we might experience more harder outlooks on ourselves, harder outlooks on the world, a lot more hopelessness, a lot more depression, a lot more frustration. And when we can keep that scale balanced and not only just focus on what's going well, I don't want to kind of minimize the other experience as well. It's about being able to maintain that whole picture perspective, that bigger picture perspective of there's a lot going on. And if we can keep it balanced, those negative experiences, while yes, they're still challenging and unpleasant and not ideal, there's a little bit more capacity to stay feeling a little bit more regulated or grounded or settled, or also being able to be more responsive to whatever might be going on. So that we have more energy to say, like, yeah, you know what, I want to give some of my fight energy to fighting for things I think are worth fighting for without burning myself out. So with that balanced scale, we can keep things a little bit more responsive rather than just reactive. So how do we balance out that scale? So we want to balance out that scale by taking, just a few seconds to kind of recognize what's happening. So again, like we were talking about before, the awareness is kind of like a superpower of what our stress response is telling us. And then when we're able to really intentionally notice those moments in life that feel good, or that are easy, or that are gentle, or moments where we feel safe, or moments where we feel content. So it's not just about noticing what we're grateful for. It's also those moments that feel easy, or that feel safe, or that feel gentle. And when we intentionally notice those moments, instead of just brushing them off or ignoring them, for as little as 20 or 30 seconds, studies are suggesting, we can add a little bit of weight to that positive side of the scale so that things can feel more balanced. And like all of these practices, the more we practice them, the easier they can become. So I invite you in this moment to just take a moment to maybe intentionally notice something that was maybe easy for you today, or yesterday, or the day before, if nothing is coming from today or yesterday. Or maybe in this moment, are you feeling comfortable sitting in your chair? Are you feeling comfortable standing up at your desk, however you may be watching this one? Just intentionally noticing, like, yeah, I'm really enjoying this cup of coffee I'm having. I'm really enjoying the comfort of this chair. I'm really enjoying my comfortable shoes. Whatever feels easy for you to notice, take a moment to really notice it, kind of soak it in, so to speak, even if it's something as simple as a cup of coffee or a glass of water. And if there's anything that you're noticing right now that you want to share in the chat with us here, please feel free to share it in the chat. I'm noticing that I'm having a lot of fun with this webinar. So I'm just going to intentionally savor that one as we go and breathe it in. And another tool for us today is self-compassion. So this is one that, especially those of us in helping professions, we're often very good at giving compassion to others. And we forget about this for ourselves a little bit. A couple of comments coming up in the chat, feeling the sunshine. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And so this is a quote that I came across that I thought described self-compassion really well, from somebody named Kristen Neff, who does a lot of work around mindfulness and self-compassion. And so they had mentioned self-compassion is a practice of goodwill, not good feelings. With self-compassion, we mindfully accept that the moment is painful and embrace ourselves with kindness and care in response, remembering that imperfection is part of the shared human experience. So some ways of practicing self-compassion, some ways that people find really supportive is to have a little bit of a saying to kind of come back to. So at the beginning with the stop tool, we were practicing, noticing our breathing or noticing any one of our senses, like our sense of sight or our sense of smell or our sense of hearing, whatever is most accessible to us. And some people find it really helpful to have a bit of a saying to anchor themselves back to. So an anchor is the thing that holds a ship in place. So regardless of whatever happens to the ship, whether there's a lot of waves or a lot of wind, that anchor is helping it come back to its center so that it can be, I don't know if a ship can be more responsive, but so that we can be more responsive in life rather than just reactive. And sometimes people find having a bit of a mantra or a bit of a saying or some words to say to themselves. So some things we can say to ourselves could be things like, this is a moment of suffering. Not easy. I don't like it. I don't enjoy this. And this is a moment that I'm experiencing. We all struggle in our lives. May I be patient with myself? It's one I often use. Or I'm not alone. And remembering that we all have our sufferings, we all have our internal struggles, we all have our stress responses. And remembering that we aren't alone in those experiences. And I think reminding ourselves that we aren't alone in those experiences can often kind of remind us in the humanness of all of this. Where even though it can be highly unpleasant to experience a moment of suffering, we've all got our own version of suffering. And there's something that's kind of poetic in that as a human being. We all have this way of being in the world. And we all have moments of beauty, moments of bliss, and moments of suffering. And it's part of being human. There's nothing wrong with us for having those moments. This is another quote that I came across that I thought tied in really well to this webinar, where it is time we start valuing the incredible capacity of our biology to find a way in hard times. Reminding ourselves that those stress responses of fight, freeze, and shutdown, or maybe we experience all of the above all the time, or whatever it might be, that even though it's highly unpleasant to experience, it's actually quite brilliant on the part of the biology as a way to try to manage those hard times. So I wonder if bringing some appreciation to our biology can also support us in coming back to our window of tolerance and being able to be more responsive to those moments in life that are quite challenging. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it's great that we have these mindfulness tips and tricks that support us along the way. It's also extremely important to remember that we don't need to do this on our own, that there is help available 24/7 in a variety of forms across BC, along with the ones that were mentioned at the beginning of today's workshop. I also want to highlight the fact that there's the 1-800-suicide line, the mental health support line, and the national crisis line of 988 that are available for everybody in our communities. And no problem is too big or too small. So if ever you find yourself in that stress response and you're like, I just need to talk to somebody and I don't know who to talk to, please know that you can call these numbers, that they are there for everybody. And if you do want any more information on other trainings for adults, whether the suicide response trainings that were mentioned at the beginning, or crisis response trainings, or other trainings in wellness and resiliency, the Crisis Center also offers free programming for youth around mindfulness and self-care. And there's also suicide, grief, and bereavement support groups that are offered through the Crisis Center. So if you have any questions or curiosities about those, you're welcome to check out the Crisis Center's website or reach out to the center and they can help answer any questions that you might have, any curiosities or any concerns about it. And as we start coming up to kind of the end of our time together today, I want to summarize the different ways that we were speaking to today. So we started talking a little bit about the science of stress and well-being with that window of tolerance and how it's perfectly normal for us to go in and out of our window of tolerance pretty much each and every day. And the more that we can learn to recognize where we're at, whether it's in our window of tolerance or we're out of our window of tolerance, the more that we can support ourselves and meet ourselves where we're at. So especially as those of us in helping professions, we often think of, let me meet others where they're at and not where we would like them to be. And let's see if we can bring some of that energy to ourselves over the next coming weeks. Can we meet ourselves where we're at rather than where we would like to be? Knowing that even just by meeting ourselves where we're at fundamentally supports us to come back to our window of tolerance and be more responsive. And we went over that STOP tool. That's a handy little acronym that stood for stop, take a breath, observe ourselves and our surroundings. And doing that allows us to proceed a little bit more thoughtfully, knowing that there's no one perfect way to practice any of these tools. But, getting curious about them over the next couple of weeks and seeing how they might be supportive in your daily life. And thinking of it in terms of, you could practice it before you get out of bed in the morning, when you're trying to go to sleep, while you're brushing your teeth, while you're doing some dishes. And while you're in the middle of a meeting and things are starting to escalate a little bit, what happens when we stop, take a breath, observe a little bit, and then proceed a bit more? We spoke about mitigating the negativity bias, where for a variety of reasons, negative experiences get integrated into our physiology in a deeper way than positive experiences do. So it's important that we highlight and intentionally notice those moments in our lives that feel easy or that feel safe or that we feel content for things, and really noticing them rather than just brushing them off, kind of savoring them and soaking in that sunshine, so to speak. And taking a moment to give ourselves some compassion, knowing that we are going through incredibly challenging times as human beings, whether it's in our personal lives or globally, there is a lot going on. And the more we can bring a bit of compassion to ourselves, knowing that it makes sense that we might be feeling more flight energy, more fight energy, more freeze energy, or more shutdown energy these days. Biologically, it makes a lot of sense, even though it can be highly unpleasant to experience. If we can bring some compassion to ourselves, it can make it a little bit easier as we go throughout our days. So as we come up to the end of our time together, I want to say thank you again for being here with me. I really enjoy being able to share this information with our communities. And there's couple of moments left. So if you've got any questions or comments or curiosities, please feel free to share them in the chat, as some of you are doing. And then I wish you a hopefully easy day, and soak in that sunshine if you enjoy the sunshine. Take care, folks. And one question coming up is, could you please speak a little about social health and the importance of finding people you feel seen, heard, understood for stress management? Absolutely. I think we could definitely do that in another webinar. And even in a short moment, what that's making me think of is the importance of shared reality and the importance of community and feeling understood. And when we feel understood by folks, it supports us in feeling connected to another, right? And fundamentally, human beings want connection. So it makes a lot of sense, this question. And what's kind of resonating for me is the more that we feel understood and the importance of that in our communities can help us come to that window of tolerance a little bit more easily. Yeah, and I would love to do an entire webinar on that topic. Thanks for asking that, Jillian. Great question.